I'm in awe of this and this realization. You know, reports suggest that many game developers were caught off guard by Sony's digital shift, with several studios mad about the move. There's a reason why this feeling is awe, but I'll get into it after I read the article to you. And everything and get straight to it. Developers are furious with Sony over digital only move. Studios were blindsided, says analyst. Game developers are not happy with Sony for going digital with game releases. YouTuber Moore's Law has did revealed that studios were completely blindsided by the announcement. Bigger studios had a more neutral response, however. Most developers are furious. You know, physical media has been on a slow decline in every sector of entertainment, with gaming being no exception. The biggest title launching this year, GTA, is also skipping disk drives, opting for code and box instead. Regardless, no one expect no. So, as for myself, after somebody pointed out they couldn't take digital your physical copies away from you, I really I I stopped going to retail outlets like physical stores to buy games, but I would buy physical through the internet from the companies that I was working with directly, and that was all I would buy. I would never buy the game cards that were coming out from, Nintendo. And the thing is that I've turned it into like pretty loyal to Nintendo at this point, because history, like I saw what happened. Sony's platform went downhill, and Nintendo's went uphill, and got better and better and better for Nintendo fans and Nintendo owners and everything. And it just kept going in that direction ever since the launch of the DS, and everything. And really, this could harken back a little bit further to the Wii. I mean, we got Final Fantasy IV, the after years on the Wii and everything, and then they went on the DS, and they went in this handheld only direction, and it's just been, absolutely crazy and mad times since then, and just fun, 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 and Nintendo basically engineered a massive comeback after the disaster that happened, and anyways. No one expected one of the gaming giants to announce the end of game disc this generation, and that is why Sony's recent decision has angered a sizable portion of its fan base. As it turns out, however, the players aren't the only ones that feeling alienated by this move. Why it matters, developers are also hardcore gamers who grew up with physical media. Hence, this anger towards Sony makes complete sense. No disc for you. According to analysts, Moore's Law is dead. Developers are not happy with Sony for announcing the termination of physical game six starting in 2028. The YouTuber talked to several studios and reported that none of them were in support of the Japanese new giant's new strategy. The game developers that I talked to were blind. I didn't. So nobody's happy with it. Developers were completely blindsided by this move, and no one knew beforehand that Sony would announce something so drastic. According to the YouTuber, the larger studios cared less about the company going digital, but most of the developers that he talked to were furious. In addition, Moore's Law also revealed that Sony was expecting the backlash from the entire gaming community, fan and as developers. As a result, is going to take a break from social media to avoid the fallout. Even though physical game sales are only accounted for about 3% of Sony's overall gaming revenue, there's a core fan base that still purchases disk drive for one reason or another, and Sony is alienating a sizable portion of its players by taking this precedent so early. Anyways, the developers are alienated, and this, if you know your history within the gaming space, the awe is now washing over you in a way because you know, it is literally history at this point that one of the ways that Sony managed to claw a foothold and everything into the gaming space and everything was that, in the 1990s at the tail end, like about 1997, 1990, 6 and everything, the Super Nintendo was kind of on its way out. It was kind of the last little bits of that generation, and there was a kerfuffle that happened when, Sony was basically trying to team up with Nintendo and release a disc drive, console with them, and then Nintendo backed out of the deal and everything that they were, the intersection between them, and then, because they had backed out of the deal. Sony said fuck them and decided to burn them by going and releasing the disc, the the physical disc anyway, anyways and everything. And so began, the PlayStation and everything, and Sony going independent from them and everything, and ending the collaboration between them and other companies. And what happened was that most of the third-party developers that were making software for them as a platform migrated over into Sony's camp, and with them came, Square Enix and a bunch of other companies that took their games off Nintendo's platforms. And so for a whole console generation and everything, the N64 only ended up with about six RPGs and everything. And, sorry, not the Nintendo Switch, the, the N64, sorry, only ended up with about five, turn-based RPGs or like role-playing games, period. And some of them were probably not turn-based and everything, but that was all they had on the N64. And as a consequence, like millions and millions of people had migrated to Sony because Sony had the better gaming library, and it didn't matter if you were the kind of person that wanted to play, Final Fantasy Tactics and the Final Fantasy games, and get into these tactical RPGs, and also explore these role-playing turn-based games and everything, because there were games that weren't that kind of style and everything on the PlayStation and everything. And lots and lots of people were getting into it, like Tony Hawk's Pro Skaters, and the Twisted Metal games. And I mean, there were just all these games and franchises that became super popular on Sony's platform. And Spyro was big and everything. And that happened. And it was intriguing for a bit and everything, for a whole generation and everything, what had happened, because Sony had clawed back. But in retrospect, it seems like the corporate arrogance started almost the moment the PlayStation 2 launched, and it's been downhill since the PlayStation 2, really, with respect to Sony's consoles. So, you end up at the PlayStation 2, and, for a while we had the Girl Lancer series, which has become, talked about here on YouTube and everything, and that launched, and I just recently got my hands on it because I'm a big fan of Working Designs, the now defunct Japanese localization studio and everything. Like when I was growing up, we had the Super Nintendo, but we also had the Sega Genesis, and to our surprise, they went out and got the CD drive and expansion for it and everything. And there weren't a lot of games for it. There was like Sonic CD and a few others that were just kind of like showcasing the power of it. But Working Designs was bringing over these Japanese RPGs that would not have otherwise come over to the United States. No how, no way about all of it. And so we got really into Lunar right then on the original import of it to the United States. I spent the 90s absolutely scouring Portland and the Portland market for a copy of Lunar 2, which never turned up ever. It had never shown up at all and everything. And so, by 2000, when we got access to eBay, that's when I finally was like, hey, this is a much bigger market where everything seems to be available. Why don't we do a search for Lunar 2? And then I got my hands on a copy of the Sega CD version for $30. But then they just a few months later they announced a remake of it and a remaster of the whole thing on the PlayStation, and so we pre-ordered that and everything, and went through that whole experience. And so, this has been going on now for a while and everything. And, we, I bought it via eBay at that point and everything. And, I became an eBayer back then. And eBay was such a revolution because I had been, so used to going to the video game shop and them not having what I wanted to buy available at the store, because RPGs were popular, but they were never quite popular enough, to for stores to have, some of those more off the beaten track RPGs, and turn-based RPGs in stock. They were often not there at all, and so if you were into this kind of game, some of them will skyrocket to somebody that likes the subgenre. Like, that copy of Lunar 2 spent a good amount of time on the eBay market selling for $300 to $500 at this point, because people will pay a pretty penny. to play this game, and the company that made it went out of business and everything that imported it to the United States, and they went out of their way, balls to the walls with packaging and everything, and made really great packaging for these games and other games and everything. And so, if you were a sucker for that kind of thing, and I am, certainly, they uh, they catered to you and everything. And so, we got these visually stunning packages, and then we played these games, and I was a really big fan of all of them. And this all happened and migrated to the PlayStation and everything because of the fuck up that happened at Nintendo, where Nintendo launched another cartridge-based console that developers did not want to make games for. They wanted to make games for disc and everything and put them on the laser disc and everything. And it was that act of alienating third-party developers that had enabled, you know, Sony to grab, you know, uh, to win that generation and everything, and then follow it up with a massive victory by the PlayStation 2. But by the PlayStation 2 era, they had alienated working designs and had gotten arrogant to the point in which, they were alienating third-party developers already by that point and everything. And as a result, the PlayStation 3 ended up being a much more underwhelming following up, and then the PlayStation 4 was a little bit less, and then finally the PlayStation 5 has just been a clusterfuck, and everything, and just doing absolutely terrible and everything. And then this happened, and developers are now pissed. You know, the developers themselves, and if you piss off developers, that's how you get them to go into Nintendo's wheelhouse and say fuck this again and back towards Nintendo. Because now it looks like the more attractive option for many third-party developers to migrate towards. And so, I predict that this is going to be a much bigger disaster for Sony than it realizes. You know, you just alienated and pissed off a lot of third-party devs and everything. Good luck keeping them now.